Rabbi, is there a proper blessing for the cicadas? Now, no one's asked me that question, unfortunately, but the answer would be the same as the rabbi's response in the opening scene of Fiddler. A blessing for the cicadas, of course. May God bless and keep the cicadas far away from us. Now, the cicadas last appeared 17 years ago, 34 years ago, and 51 years ago in 1970, the year before the iconic Fiddler on the Roof graced American movie screens for the first time. Each year, like clockwork, the bugs go away, and yes, it appears this year, again, our wish will be granted. The cicadas seem to be departing, by which I mean littering fields and roads and sidewalks with their carcasses. Yuck. But my topic today is not the cicadas. And it's not Fiddler on the Roof, though that's probably worth a sermon too. It's another event that occurred in 1971, 50 years ago this week. Today I've been asked to speak on this, the 50th anniversary of Richard Nixon's war on drugs. I want to thank Evan Serpic, our social action co-chair, food distribution guru, and communications director from Open Society Institute, for bringing this important milestone series to my attention and for asking me to be a part of it. The story of racialized drug policy in America is much like the story of the cicadas. They come, they go, they return, things go underground, things present themselves once again. Just as this month's 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre reminds us that anti-Black racism returns again and again in varying forms and expressions, the 50th anniversary of an American president calling drugs public enemy number one should challenge us to consider the lasting implications of that statement. Here's the irony. When objects become personified, persons become objectified. There was a time that human beings, by law, were considered property in this country, less than human. American chattel slavery was meant to end, of course, at Appomattox, but as we acknowledge today, Juneteenth, on our newest federal holiday, it took months for word to reach the forced labor plantations of Texas. Keyshawn Johnson, Nachshon, who often attends Beth Am and sometimes sends his reflections on issues relevant to the story of Jewish descendants of African slavery, shared a provocative metaphor that the end of the Civil War temporarily answered the question of, quote, whether America should be a concealed carry or open carry white supremacy country. Concealed carry won for the moment, and freedom was on the menu for the American descendants of slavery, he writes. But while legal slavery ended today, June 19, 1865, bigotry, of course, did not. Humans found new ways to diminish the humanity of African Americans, reneging on 40 acres and a mule, imposing segregation and de jure discrimination through Jim Crow laws. Mass incarceration was a direct and inevitable outgrowth of Nixon's failed drug policy. Of course, Richard Nixon didn't view it as a failure, and neither did subsequent presidents, Republican and Democratic, who pushed again and again to renew hundreds of billions of dollars in spending to defeat the drugs, tough on crime, narcotics, sentencing disparities, mandatory minimums, stop and frisk, and numerous other policies, all of which led to the meteoric growth of the for-profit prison industry. Meanwhile, over the past decade, approximately the same number of Americans have died of overdose as have those from COVID-19. Rabbi, is there a proper blessing for the drug czar? But at its core, the problem with the war on drugs is that it falsely portrays those who struggle with addiction as either irredeemable criminals or hapless victims. As I said, when objects become personified, persons have a tendency to become objectified. We are in a crisis, writes Erica Paulette, Director of Faith and Community Partnerships at the National Harm Reduction Coalition. We're in a crisis when whole people created in the image of the most divine, are redacted and fractured, reduced to behaviors and pathologies, dehumanized. We're in a crisis which stigmatizes and others our most vulnerable neighbors. We are in a crisis which fails to recognize God in Black and brown people, which terrorizes Black communities through mass surveillance and brutality. Now, amidst such a long-standing crisis, it's easy to lose hope. So perhaps it's beshert, it's destined in a way that this week's parasha begins with our ancestors' arrival to Midbar Tzin, the wilderness of Tzin. This matters because it's the first moment in decades that the story of wandering takes a truly hopeful turn. Remember, for the previous 38 years, those who left Egypt have been dead men walking of sorts, sentenced to perish in the wilderness for having cast their lot with the ill-fated spies. By tradition, on Tisha B'Av, the Jewish national day of mourning, 2 years after the Exodus. Our sages envision in a midrash a haunting ritual in which each year the Israelites would dig their own graves and then sleep in them on the 9th of Av. In the morning, Moses would call out, "Let all those who are living arise and separate themselves from the dead." According to Rabbi Yosef Ber Soloveitchik's understanding, they died 38 consecutive times in the desert. Life was no different from death, a life without hope and anticipation. It did not matter if they survived any particular year, eventually they would all die. That's why the enigmatic red heifer story of Numbers chapter 19 that we read today occurs where it does in the Torah, because it's a bridge connecting events that occur 38 years apart, from the rebellion of Korach from chapter 16 to 18 to the arrival at the border of the Promised Land in chapter 20. 38 years in a moment about which we know very little. The whole purpose of the Parah Adumah is the purification of those who have come in contact with death. Soloveitchik says it represents a triumph over death, an affirmation of life. So how does our haunting story conclude? With the people digging their graves on Tisha B'Av in that 40th year, only to find each and every person alive the next morning. So confused, they sleep in their graves again and again, until finally, after 6 nights have passed, they understand Dor HaMidbar, the wilderness generation, has ended and a new generation with a brighter and unwritten future has begun. What calendar day was that? Tu B'Av, the Jewish National Day of Love. Having never struggled with addiction and recovery, I cannot say if the story is resonant for those who have. But I do think it's relevant as a metaphor for racialized drug policies, because those policies have kept people of color again and again in their place, as it were, a lower place, and in too many cases, in their graves. So with regard to American drug policy, how do we break the cycle of stigmatization, vilification, and dehumanization? First, we have to name and accept that these policies were never well-intentioned. And they were never designed to succeed at ending addiction or helping those who use drugs. Make no mistake, they were designed to solidify power in the hands of some by depriving the liberty of others. Nixon's launch to stardom and to the presidency, I think, is instructive here. It began with his service on the House Un-American Activities Committee, where he became obsessed with a certain Alger Hiss, purported Soviet spy of Baltimore, Maryland. In fact, it was blocks from where I stand now at 2113 Callow Avenue, here in Reservoir Hill, where Whittaker Chambers testified that he met with Hiss and a mysterious photographer named Felix to photograph secret documents. Chambers, by then, was a Time magazine senior editor and noted anti-communist. He testified, though, that in the late 1930s, he had been a communist spy. I first learned about this story and its connection to our neighborhood from Gil Sandler, alav shalom, who wrote about this in the Sun paper back in 1994 and shared it and other neighborhood stories during one of his inimitable annual fund appeals on Rosh Hashanah here at Beth Am. Incidentally, Felix turns out to have been Felix Inslerman, who was later questioned by Joseph McCarthy's Committee on Government Operations and its committee counsel, Roy Cohn. Cohn, of course, was mentor to a young Donald Trump and helped shape much of his own worldview. What's the through line here? Nixon, McCarthy, Cohn, Trump, these are men who perfected the art of dehumanization, of weaponizing innuendo and shaping policies of American paranoia. In Nixon's case, this is clearly expressed in an interview given to journalist Dan Baum in 1994 and published in the April 2016 cover story of Harper's. Baum cites Nixon's domestic policy chief, John Ehrlichman, who, according to Baum, made this extraordinary statement. The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, he said, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. Jill Lepore details Nixon's ideology and approach in her seminal work, These Truths. Nixon, in defeating Jerry Voorhees for his first seat in Congress in California, exploited voters' unease with a distant government run by Ivy League educated bureaucrats. He found it took only the merest of gestures to convince voters that there was something un-American about people like Voorhees, people like them. His campaign motto, Richard Nixon is one of us. And that's where I want to conclude today, by inviting us beyond the simplistic binaries of villains like Richard Nixon into our humanity. Jewish tradition insists that we are not objects, but people, indeed reflections of God in the world. No matter our race, no matter our health status, no matter our religion or gender or sexual orientation, no matter if we use drugs or don't use drugs. The war on drugs is a war on people. Worse, it's a war on specific people, for the most part, who are battle-weary and understandably fed up. We need to be mindful of that history on this day and every day. A new federal holiday is great, but it's no panacea. The work of avoiding the cicada-like cyclical emergence of white supremacy is not easy. It requires patience and vigilance to reduce the harm done again and again to Black and brown Americans. But my friends, the trends are promising. The will to change does seem to be present. 83% of Americans admit the war on drugs has failed. 65% of voters support ending it. 64% of Americans support repealing mandatory minimum sentences for drug crimes. 61% of voters support commuting or reducing the sentences of people incarcerated for drugs. May this 50th year of the war on drugs find it coming to an end. May it be like the 40th year of wandering in the wilderness, a respite for the weary, on the precipice of the promised land. In the words of Soloveitchik, a triumph over death, an affirmation of life. Happy Juneteenth and Shabbat Shalom.